Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Percy's Brides by Ivy Hart. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, 1886, Percy. Percy Sutton stood on the threshold of his ambition, the doorway of Sutton's Hardware Emporium, looking out over the dusty main street of Eldorado Creek. The morning sun, barely cresting the black hills, threw long shadows across a thoroughfare that was already bustling with fortune seekers and tradesmen. The street expanding out before Percy was a testament to the human spirit's tenacity, a chaotic symphony of clattering wagons, shouting vendors, and the persistent cough of dust that hung in the air. Men laden with mining gear jostled past one another, their faces set in expressions of hope and desperation, all seeking the same elusive glimmer beneath the earth. Percy's decision to leave the green pastures of his family homestead, where his three older brothers would carry on the Sutton legacy, had not been an easy one. But it was made with the determination to forge his own path. He only traveled a few hours into the nearest town, Eldorado Creek, where he saw a business opportunity. Now, as the owner of the most frequented hardware store in town, a swell of pride rises within him. He was indeed making it on his own. With practiced ease, he reached for the painted sign that hung beside the door, a sturdy piece of wood with closed, facing outwards. His fingers, calloused from handling the tools and wares of his trade, flipped the sign with a satisfying swivel to reveal open in bold, welcoming letters. The sign, crafted by his own hand, bore the careful brushstrokes of a man who valued precision and care in every aspect of his work. As the door to the hardware store swung open, the bell chimed merrily, heralding the arrival of Percy's first customer of the day, old Jeb Thompson, a regular with a penchant for humor as dry as the prairie. Jeb sauntered in, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, a grin spreading beneath his wiry mustache. Jeb stepped into the cool shadow of the store with a purposeful gait. "Morning, Percy. I'll be needing a couple of pounds of nails and some of that wire you got in last week," he said, moving his hat back slightly. Percy nodded, already mentally locating each item in the store. "Sure thing, Jeb. How's that fence coming along?" "Slow and steady, just like the missus cooking," Jeb quipped, his eyes crinkling with mirth. He leaned on the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "But, Percy, what you really need isn't in these aisles. When you gonna find yourself a bride? There ain't no eligible ladies left around these parts. Might be time to send off for one of them mail order brides, eh?" He chuckled, clearly amused by his suggestion. Percy laughed, shaking his head at Jeb's playful ribbing. The notion seemed as far-fetched as the tales of fortune told by prospectors passing through, yet it lingered in the air like the scent of sawdust as he collected the nails and fencing wire. "How about this, Jeb? Will this get the job done?" Percy gestured to the items. Jeb peered over his spectacles at the supplies before him. "Yep, that'll hold the old corral together. Let's tack it on my account, will you?" He scratched at the stubble on his chin, an easy smile playing on his lips, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepening. Percy hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering to the ledger underneath the counter. Things had been unpredictable lately, and accounts were growing longer, like shadows at sunset. He took a deep breath, resigned to the reality of their small community's ebbs and flows. "All right, Jeb, I'll add it to your account, but let's remember the deal. Settle up by month's end, okay?" Percy met Jeb's gaze to ensure his point was made. Jeb moved his hat with a grin, the silver streaks in his hair catching the light. "You have my word, Percy. I'll pay you back with a little extra for your trust. How's that sound?" "Sounds fair. Just don't let it slip your mind, or I might start taking payment in chickens or apple pies from the missus," he joked, allowing the warmth of community interest to seep back into the moment. Jeb scooped up the nails and wire. "You won't have to take that kind of payment, Percy. My word's as solid as the oak in your shelves." He pointed at Percy. "And don't you go dismissing those mail order brides too quickly. Some of the fellows around here have done all right for themselves that way." "Take care, Jeb," Percy replied with a smile. He held the door open, watching Jeb step out into the brightness of the day. The door swung shut with a soft click, leaving Percy in contemplative silence. The very idea seemed foreign to him. True, a handful of men in town had found a measure of happiness, or at least companionship, with women from back east. But Percy couldn't fathom it for himself. He shook his head gently. No, his heart yearned for something that couldn't be summarized in a few letters and exchanged photographs. It yearned for something real and tangible, like the wood he carved and the earth he'd once toiled. The tide of Percy's musings was swiftly interrupted as the morning's quietude gave way to the bustling energy of the day's first rush. Miners, clad in the worn fabrics of their trade, trudged off to work in the coal mines outside of town. The smell of fresh bread wafted on the air as the bakery ovens fired up. Kids ran aimlessly in a game of chasey, untethered due to a lack of school. The town, a hive of enterprise and dogged pursuit, was a far cry from the tranquil pastures of his family's farm. Here, the air was always thick with the fine grit of the earth that the miners came to sift through their fingers. The street was lined with buildings thrown together with hope and haste. A saloon, a boarding house, the general store, a church, all catering to the needs of those who sought their fortune in the coal-laden hills. Percy's store was a haven amidst the chaos. The shelves were neatly lined with tools and supplies, and the smell of wood and iron provided a grounding scent. As the door swung open and closed with customers, Percy found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity, much like the dust devils that would spontaneously dance upon the street, only to dissipate as quickly as they appeared. The intensity of the day grew into the afternoon. Percy had a moment of respite where he took out his ledger to plan orders to restock what he had sold that morning. The occasional glance out the store windows, cleaned to a shine, caught the reflections of the townspeople as they began to mill about, starting their various pursuits of the day. Percy set the ledger aside and turned his attention to the array of new mining picks that adorned the display near the window. Sunlight from the sun streamed in, catching the polished metal and making the tools gleam like treasures themselves. Each pick, with its razor-sharp point and handle worn smooth from careful craftsmanship, stood as a testament to both efficacy and endurance. As he arranged them, ensuring each pick was presented as at its best, the sounds and sights of Eldorado Creek's main street beckoned to him through the open door. The dynamic pulse of the town's heart was a siren call, reminding him that he was part of something much larger than his store. He was part of a community teetering on the edge of tomorrow's promise. Percy stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk that ran the length of the street. The planks, worn smooth by the passage of countless boots, creaked softly beneath his weight. He cast a friendly nod to Mrs. Thorne, the proprietor of the neighboring bakery, whose morning ritual of sweeping the boardwalk in front of her shop filled the air with the comforting scent of fresh bread and cinnamon. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thorne. Smells like you've outdone yourself again today," Percy called out, his voice carrying over the din of the street. Mrs. Thorne paused her sweeping, a cloud of flour dusting her apron, and smiled in response. "If you've a mind for a treat later, I might have apple turnovers for you." "I wouldn't miss it," Percy replied with a grin, already anticipating the midday break he'd take, punctuated by the sweet buttery layers of Mrs. Thorne's famed pastries. As he turned back to his store, he caught sight of old man Higgins leading his mule down the street, a familiar sight in Eldorado Creek. Higgins, a prospector whose luck in finding gold had long since run out, now found a meager living doing odd jobs for the townsfolk. He refused to go in the coal mines, choosing to find gold in the Black Hills, determined to prove everyone wrong. "How's Bessie today?" Percy asked, referring to the mule who walked beside the old man. Higgins stopped, moving his hat back to wipe his brow. "Ah, Percy, she's stubborn as ever, but we're getting by." As Higgins continued along the street, Percy's attention was caught by the laughter of children playing a game of tag in the street. Darting between wagons and townspeople with the boundless energy of youth. He watched them for a moment, the joy in their faces a sharp contrast to the grizzled miners who scarcely looked up from the dirt beneath their boots. Maybe one day he would have his own thing. "Percival Sutton, you'd turn into one of these bolts and screws if you sat any longer at that desk," exclaimed the lively Mrs. Sutton, her eyes twinkling with the same vibrancy that had guided Percy through his childhood. A shawl wrapped around her shoulders, then a hat perched on her untamable silver curls, she held out her arms as she approached. "Mother, I do believe I'd be a hinge, always stuck in one place, opening and closing the day with regularity." Mrs. Sutton set down her basket, bustling over to peck Percy in the cheek. "A hinge, perhaps, but essential to the door swing. Still, you need oiling, my boy, or you'll rust in place." Percy's laughter mingled with the clinking of metal and wood around him, a melody that softened the edges of his solitary world. "And what brings you here today, mother? Surely not just to rescue me from the perils of stationary life." With a mock sigh, Mrs. Sutton motioned to her basket, revealing a hearty loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and a pot of stew. "Well, I thought I'd check on my favorite son," she said, her eyes alight with mischief. "Well, you should come by more often if that's the case. And how are my older three brothers?" His mother visited him regularly since the homestead was within easy traveling distance for them. They are fine. It is you I'm worried about, she retorted, setting the items on a cleared space on the counter. You worry unnecessary, said Miss Percy. And my sister Lila, how is she? Full of energy as always. Now it is time you knocked off for the day. How about we take a stroll by the river? Said Mrs. Sutton. All right, Mom. Percy placed the basket inside his store, turning the sign to closed, and then walked with his mother down the street. His mother filled him in on the goings-on at the homestead, and it was good to hear his brothers were well and the farm a success. They left behind the afternoon activities of the town and turned to the river, a calming artery of the landscape flowing with a constancy that seemed to mock the dangers of the nearby coal mine. It was a mere stone's throw from the parched dust of the town, but it might as well have been a world away. The river ran cool and clear, its banks lush and verdant, offering a soothing contrast to the arid hustle of the streets. His thoughts were lost in the water until the wind blew his mother's words back to him and he nearly choked on them. She started her usual lecture on how he needed to marry. Don't you go thinking a woman's regard is all the company need, Percy. When was the last time you took a nice girl out to the social? Percy rolled his eyes, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him with a smile. Mother, when would I find the time? The store keeps me busy enough. Nonsense. There's always time for a bit of happiness, Percy. You just must be willing to open the door, or in your case, unhinge yourself. In good time, I will. Percy, have you ever considered a mail order bride? She asked casually, as if suggesting a new brand of humor. Percy nearly choked on his last bite of bread. A mail order bride, Mother? That's a bit drastic, don't you think? Oh, pish posh, Mrs. Sutton waved away his concern with a flick of her wrist. It's not as uncommon as you might think, and it's practical. You can find a woman who's looking for the same things you want. And what might those things be? A love for inventory lists and the sweet scent of sawdust in the morning? Percy, you need someone who compliments you, a woman who brings warmth to your life, someone to make this store, well, less like a store and more like a home. His mother replied, her voice softening. So I write a letter and what? Wait for a wife to arrive in the post along with spare parts for a plow? It's not quite that simple, but yes, she insisted. You write about yourself, your life, your hopes for the future. And a woman, perhaps one tired of the hustle and bustle of the city, yearning for the honest simplicity of a life out here, will read it and write back. And if she's more interested in the prospect of the West than the man she's writing to, then you will use your considerable charm to win her over just like you do with your customers. Percy shook his head, his laughter mingling with a deep sense of pragmatism. Mother, that's a romantic notion, but I think I'll stick to the traditional ways. If love is meant to find me, it'll walk through that door. He gestured to the front of the store, on its own 2 feet, not in an envelope. But Percy, it's the modern age. We have to use every available resource, and it's not as if you're giving the traditional ways a whirl, are you? I suppose not, Percy admitted. The mail order brides, it sounds so transactional. I'd rather meet someone naturally, even if it takes a bit longer. Mrs. Sutton sighed, a bit of defeat shadowing her spirited demeanor. All right, my boy, I just want to see you happy and maybe a little less alone. I am happy, Mother, and I'm not alone. I have you, don't I? Besides, who knows what tomorrow might bring? Yes, who knows indeed, she said, walking closer to him and patting him on the cheek affectionately. Just promise me you'll at least be open to the possibility of love, however it may find you. I promise, Mother. And who knows, maybe one day someone will walk in looking for a hammer and leave having nailed down my heart. Mrs. Sutton chuckled, warmth returning to her eyes. I'll hold you to that, Percy. In the meantime, I'll be knitting baby booties in anticipation. With a final laugh and shake of his head, Percy began walking back towards the town. His mother would stay upstairs in the spare room, which was fast becoming her second home, considering how much she visited. His gaze instinctively drifting towards the steeple of the church that rose above the small town. The church had always been a cornerstone of Percy's life, its teachings guiding him through trials and triumphs alike. The idea of a mail-order bride, which had seemed so amusing when his mother suggested it, tugged at his sense of morality. Would such a union be blessed? Would it be part of God's plan? His faith taught him that marriage was a sacred bond, one to be entered into with deliberation and prayer, not the impulsiveness of loneliness or the convenience of a transaction. He pondered the type of woman who would agree to marry a man she'd never met. Was she driven by desperation, adventure, or by faith of her own? Did she share his values, his love for the small rhythms of life in the town, his commitment to community and church? God, if this path is one you wish for me, guide me. Let me not be led astray by my desires, but by your will. The church's steeple cast a long shadow that reached towards the store as if trying to offer its own kind of guidance. Percy had always believed that God worked in mysterious ways, perhaps even through channels of a mail-order matrimonial service. He left the possibility of a mail-order bride as an open question, one to be revisited with careful thought, and most importantly, a prayerful heart.